For centuries we thought we understood Easter Island's mysterious stone giants. Then Grok AI took another look, and what it found could completely change the story. Nearly 900 Moai have stood across this remote island for more than 1,000 years. But when Elon Musk's Grok AI analyzed geological surveys, GPS data, structural models, astronomical measurements, and archaeological findings together, it uncovered patterns that raise a disturbing question. What if the Moai were never simply monuments? The analysis points towards something far stranger. The famous red stone pukao may have carried a hidden meaning. Ancient roads, thought to be used for transporting the statues, may not have worked the way researchers assumed, and an old linguistic mystery could potentially hold clues to how the island's builders understood their own world. If you love mysteries like this, hit like and subscribe. It helps us uncover more hidden stories. But the biggest revelation comes later. According to the analysis, Easter Island may have been designed around a system connecting its statues, landscape, resources, and celestial observations in ways we're only beginning to understand. And the most unsettling question is this: did the people who built this extraordinary system eventually lose the knowledge needed to understand it themselves? What we thought we knew. Let's start with what's already true, because even the accepted version of this story is remarkable enough to stop you in your tracks. Rapa Nui, the name the island's original inhabitants gave it, long before European sailors renamed it after the day they stumbled onto it, sits in the South Pacific, roughly 2,300 miles from the nearest continent. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most isolated inhabited places on the surface of the planet. A speck of volcanic rock surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean in every direction. Somewhere between 700 and 1200 CE, a group of Polynesian voyagers found it. They crossed unimaginable distances of open water with none of the tools we'd consider essential for that journey today. No compass, no metal instruments, no charts. They read the stars. They read the way ocean swells moved beneath their hulls. They read wind shifts and the flight patterns of birds. None of it was written down, because none of it needed to be. It was carried in memory, taught parent to child, voyage after voyage, for generations. When they landed on this particular island, they found it empty. No prior inhabitants, no competing claim. Just volcanic rock, limited fresh water, and a narrow strip of habitable land in the middle of nowhere. And here's the part that has puzzled researchers for a very long time. They didn't start by building shelter. They didn't start with irrigation or harbors or roads for trade. They started carving. Deep inside a volcanic crater called Ranoraku, generation after generation of Rapa Nui carvers cut enormous humanoid figures directly out of the rock face. The average Moai stands around 13 feet tall and weighs about 14 tons. The tallest one ever successfully raised onto a platform reached 33 feet. And in the quarry, still half buried in stone, sits a Moai that was never finished. One that, had it been completed, would have stood 72 feet tall and weighed an estimated 270 tons. Let that sit for a second. A civilization with no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals of any kind attempted to carve and move a structure heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 737. By the time modern researchers had properly surveyed the island, they documented roughly 900 of these statues scattered across its surface. Some stand upright on massive stone platforms called ahu. Others have toppled over the centuries. Dozens remain frozen in the quarry, abandoned mid-carve, as if the carvers simply walked away one day and never came back. For 300 years, the explanation for all of it stayed remarkably simple. Religious monuments, ancestor worship, powerful families commissioning statues to project status and honor lineage. Case closed. And to be fair, that explanation isn't wrong exactly. Oral tradition on the island does connect the Moai to honored ancestors. The problem is that ancestor worship was treated as the entire explanation, the ceiling of the mystery, rather than the floor of it. It told us who the statues represented. It never really told us why a small population on a resource-poor island would dedicate this much of its labor across so many generations to a project with no obvious military, agricultural, or economic payoff. Consider the logistics alone. Every Moai had to be cut from solid rock using stone picks, most of them made of an even harder volcanic rock called basalt. Once freed from the quarry wall, a multi-ton statue had to be moved, sometimes for miles, across uneven terrain, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal rollers. Experimental archaeologists have since demonstrated that a Moai could be walked upright, using ropes and a rocking motion, a clever solution, but one that still required dozens of coordinated people, careful engineering, and enormous risk. One bad angle, one snapped rope, and the effort of months could shatter on the ground. Then, once a statue reached its ahu, it had to be raised upright onto the platform. Another engineering problem entirely, solved with timber levers, packed stone ramps, and sheer coordinated manpower. All of this for a population that peak estimates put it somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people at its height, on an island roughly 63 square miles in size. None of that effort makes sense if the end result was purely symbolic. People don't organize a project of that scale, generation after generation, for centuries, unless the payoff justifies the cost. That mismatch, the gap between the scale of the undertaking and the thinness of the explanation, is exactly the kind of gap Grok was set loose to close. Then Grok was handed the full data set, everything ever measured, mapped, scanned, and recorded about this island, and asked one uncomfortable question. What did we miss? The first crack, the sky in the stone. The first anomaly didn't come from a new excavation or a hidden chamber. It came from data that had existed for decades, just never analyzed altogether, at scale, by something capable of holding every measurement in its head at once. Researchers fed Grok the exact GPS coordinates of every ahu platform on the island, along with the precise compass orientation of each one, down to fractions of a degree. It's the kind of data set that's brutally tedious for a human team to cross-reference by hand across 900 individual statues and dozens of platforms, but trivial for a system built to find patterns across enormous volumes of numbers simultaneously. What came back stopped people in the room. The platforms weren't just facing the ocean, or facing inland, or oriented by whatever felt right to whoever built them. Specific platforms aligned, with startling consistency, to specific solar events: the spring equinox, the winter solstice, the zenith passage, that twice-yearly moment at this exact latitude when the sun sits directly overhead and briefly casts no shadow at all. The average angular deviation across the platforms, confirmed to have deliberate astronomical alignment, came out to roughly 0.4 of 1 degree. That's not a rough approximation. That's not close enough for a ceremonial structure. That is the kind of tolerance you'd expect from an instrument built with intent, not from guesswork, and not from coincidence repeated 900 times over. You don't accidentally orient dozens of multi-ton stone platforms to solar events with that level of precision. You do it because you know precisely what you're doing, and because getting it wrong defeats the entire purpose of building it in the first place. This alone would have justified a full re-examination of the site. It turned out to be the smallest of the discoveries still waiting in the data. The statues were pointing somewhere. Every visitor to Easter Island for the last 2 centuries has noted the same thing. The Moai face inland, watching over the villages below them, backs turned to the ocean. It's one of the most photographed details of the entire site, and it fit neatly with the ancestor worship theory. Guardians, watching over their descendants. But orientation isn't the only thing a statue encodes. A face pointed in one direction also defines a line, a sight line, extending outward behind it, off the back of the statue, out across the terrain, and eventually out over the water to the horizon. When Grok was tasked with mapping every individual Moai's exact directional sight line and extending those lines outward across the entire island, something unexpected surfaced. The lines didn't scatter randomly. They didn't point toward village centers or agricultural land or anywhere with an obvious ceremonial purpose. They converged at specific points along the island's coastline, specific bearings out over open ocean. Researchers cross-referenced those convergence points against known Polynesian voyaging routes and traditional star path navigation charts. Every single one lined up with a documented heading toward a real, distant Polynesian destination. Hawaii, the Marquesas, the Society Islands, the northern coast of New Zealand. 11 distinct convergence points were identified circling the island's perimeter. 11 navigational bearings, quietly encoded into what everyone had assumed for 3 centuries, were purely ceremonial statues. Think about what that actually means. The statues face inland. That part of the old theory holds, but their backs, their sight lines, their silent geometry point outward towards specific places thousands of miles away across open water. A monument facing its village and a navigation marker facing the ocean, built into the same object at the same time. Specialists in traditional Pacific wayfinding who reviewed this pattern described it as one of the most significant single-site data sets on Polynesian navigation ever assembled. Not because it proves the Rapa Nui invented new navigation techniques, but because it suggests they permanently recorded the ones they already had, in the one material guaranteed to outlast memory: stone. And there's a reason this particular island might have been chosen for that role. Its exact position in the Pacific offers specific advantages. Certain stars track differently from this latitude than from other islands in the network, and ocean swells arrive from directions that, to a trained navigator, carry real directional information. The island wasn't just a place people happened to land. It may have functioned as a natural observation post, and the statues, the permanent record of what that post revealed. It also helps to understand what reading a bearing like this would have actually meant to a Rapa Nui navigator centuries ago. Polynesian wayfinding didn't rely on drawing lines on paper. Navigators memorized entire mental star compasses, dividing the horizon into named directional houses, each one associated with the rising or setting point of specific stars across the seasons. A statue's sightline, pointing toward a specific stretch of horizon, wasn't just that way roughly. It corresponded to a named heading in that mental compass, one a trained navigator would recognize instantly, the way a modern sailor recognizes a compass bearing at a glance. which reframes the entire statue field. Picture a young apprentice navigator, decades before ever setting foot in a canoe bound for open water, walking the island and learning which statue pointed toward which named star house, which destination sat along that heading, roughly how many days the crossing took, what swell pattern to expect along the way. The knowledge wasn't taught in a classroom. It was taught by walking past monuments that never moved, never eroded past recognition, and never depended on any single elder surviving long enough to pass the lesson on personally. The statues did the remembering, so the people didn't have to. The hats that weren't decoration. Now to one of the strangest details Grok's analysis turned up: the hats. Many of the Moai wear large cylindrical caps carved from a bright red volcanic stone. These are called pukao, and they weren't carved anywhere near the main quarry. They came from a completely separate site called punapau, which meant an entirely additional supply chain of labor just to produce and transport them, on top of the already staggering effort required to move the statues themselves. For generations, the working theory was straightforward: prestige. A pukao meant the family commissioning that statue had the resources and status to afford the extra material and labor. A stone crown, essentially, wealth made visible. Grok's analysis looked at the physics instead of the symbolism, and the physics told a different story. When researchers ran weight distribution and vibrational modeling on statues with and without a pukao, they found that the added stone doesn't just change the statue's silhouette, it measurably changes its resonant frequency. A moai without a pukao rings at a different pitch than one wearing one when struck or subjected to vibration. That alone is an interesting engineering footnote, but then the pukao data was overlaid on the Navigational sightline map from the previous discovery, and a pattern emerged that was very hard to explain away as coincidence. Statues whose sightlines pointed toward more distant destinations were far more likely to wear a pukao. Statues aligned toward closer targets tended not to. In other words, the hat wasn't marking wealth. It was marking distance. Two resonant categories, physically built into two categories of statue, corresponding to two categories of navigational information. Not a crown, a label. The Rapa Nui weren't decorating their monuments. They were annotating a filing system, one carved from stone, organized by sound. It's worth pausing on just how much extra effort this annotation actually cost. Punapau, the pukao quarry, sits on the opposite side of the island from Rano Raraku. A single pukao could weigh several tons on its own, meaning it had to be shaped, transported across the island independently of its statue, and then somehow hoisted onto the head of a moai that might already be standing 30 feet tall on its platform. A separate, additional feat of engineering layered on top of an already extraordinary one. No civilization takes on that kind of additional cost for a purely cosmetic flourish, especially not one operating with the resource constraints Rapa Nui faced. Every extra hour spent quarrying, hauling and hoisting a pukao was an hour not spent farming, fishing, or securing fresh water on an island that had precious little of it to begin with. That cost only makes sense if the object being added carried information the builders considered essential enough to justify it. The acoustic modeling itself worked by treating each moai as a physical resonating structure, accounting for its mass, its material density, and the distribution of that mass from base to crown, and calculating how the structure would vibrate when excited by an external force, like a strike or sustained rhythmic sound nearby. Adding a pukao at the top shifts the center of mass upward and changes the volume of stone concentrated near the head, which in turn shifts the frequencies at which the whole structure naturally resonates. It's the same underlying principle that makes a tall bell and a short, wide bell ring at different pitches, despite being struck the same way. The Rapa Nui didn't need modern acoustic theory to discover this. They needed generations of builders paying close attention to how their own creations sounded and choosing deliberately to make that sound mean something. The roads that weren't roads. Easter Island has a network of paved stone paths running from the Raraku quarry toward the coast, and for as long as anyone has studied the site, the obvious explanation has been transport, the routes used to physically drag statues from where they were carved to where they'd be raised. It's a sensible theory. It's also, according to the measurements, incomplete in a very inconvenient way. When researchers compared the actual width of these roads against the base width of the Moai supposedly transported along them, several of the paths turned out to be too narrow, physically too narrow for the statue to have passed through. Whatever these particular paths were built for, hauling multi-ton stone figures wasn't the primary use. What the widths do match is people, specifically a procession of people on foot, comfortable enough for a group in most stretches, narrow enough in places to force a single file line. And the material is the tell. These roads are paved with the same resonant volcanic stone used in the statues themselves. Struck, even lightly, the surface rings. Walked over in a steady rhythm. Footsteps, drumming, a procession moving in unison. That resonance compounds, carrying sound forward along the path toward whatever waits at the end of it, which, in most cases, is a statue. A resonant statue, positioned exactly where the acoustic effect of the road would peak. These weren't transport corridors that happened to be walkable. They were built specifically to deliver a physical, sensory experience. Sound rising underfoot, sound waiting ahead, culminating at the exact point the system was designed to emphasize. The journey to the statue was engineered to be part of the message, not just the means of reaching it. As one researcher reviewing the finding put it, the Rapa Nui appear to have understood the relationship between sound and stone at a level most people would assume required modern acoustic science. And they built that understanding into their infrastructure as deliberately as they built solar alignment into their platforms. The script nobody can read. Now the part of this story that's been sitting unsolved for a century and a half. Easter Island produced one of the rarest things in human history, an independently invented writing system. It's called Rongo, a set of carved glyphs found on wooden tablets, and to this day, no one has definitively deciphered it. Dozens of researchers across multiple generations have tried and failed to crack it. In 2025, a researcher named Eric Kiley published a claim to have decoded all 26 surviving Rongo inscriptions, arguing the script functions phonetically and encodes mythology, navigational knowledge, and ritual practice. It's worth being careful here. His work hasn't achieved broad peer-reviewed acceptance yet, and Rongo has a long history of confident decipherment claims that later fell apart under scrutiny. This isn't confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. When Grok was given every documented Rongo symbol alongside the astronomical, navigational, and acoustic patterns already extracted from the statues and platforms, a structural correlation appeared, independent of Kiley's specific translation claims. Certain clusters of glyphs weren't scattered evenly across every surviving tablet. They clustered specifically on tablets associated with particular Ahu platforms, and not randomly. Symbol clusters near the equinox-aligned platforms showed patterns consistent with solar interval tracking. Symbol clusters near the navigationally oriented platforms showed patterns consistent with bearing and distance notation. If that correlation holds up under further scrutiny, it reframes what the tablets might be entirely. Not myth, not scripture, possibly a written key, an instruction manual for reading the physical monument network itself. The statues encode the information. The tablets may explain how to read it. To be clear, this is a pattern correlation, not a confirmed translation, and Rongorongo has earned every bit of the caution researchers still apply to it. But for the first time, there's a specific, falsifiable hypothesis for what portions of the script might represent, and it's grounded in the same physical data that reframed the statues themselves. The moment they stopped understanding. This is the finding that stopped everyone reviewing the analysis, because it isn't about what the Rapa Nui built. It's about when they lost the ability to build it correctly. Grok mapped the construction sequence of the statues against the precision of their astronomical and navigational alignments, cross-referencing radiocarbon dating with the angular accuracy data collected earlier. And the trend runs in exactly the wrong direction. The earliest statues at Rano show the tightest alignments of the entire site, the most accurate solar orientation, the most deliberate acoustic tuning. As construction continued across the generations, that precision doesn't hold steady. It degrades. In the earliest confirmed platforms, the average alignment error sits under 0.3 of 1 degree. By the final phase of construction, before carving stopped altogether, that error had climbed to 2.8 degrees, nearly 9 times worse. That's not a decline in effort or skill with stone carving. It's something more specific. The difference between builders who understood exactly why each statue had to face precisely where it faced, and their descendants, who understood only that it should face roughly that direction. The first generations knew the system completely. Their descendants inherited the tradition without fully inheriting the knowledge behind it, copying a practice they could see, but no longer fully interpret. Eventually, the carving stopped. The final statue at Rano was never completed. It's still there today, half emerged from the quarry wall, exactly where the last carver left it. What actually happened to them? For decades, the popular explanation for Easter Island's decline was ecological self-destruction, a civilization that deforested itself into collapse. Newer research complicates that story significantly, and it's worth putting on record here. A 2025 study published in Communications, Earth and Environment, led by researchers at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, reconstructed roughly 800 years of rainfall history on the island using chemical signatures preserved in ancient plant matter and sediment layers. It found a severe drought beginning around 1550 that lasted more than a century. A brutal stretch for an island that already had almost no permanent fresh water. Platform construction slowed sharply during this period. Leadership structures shifted. A new system called Tangata Manu emerged, where authority was earned through athletic competition rather than inherited through the bloodlines tied to the old Moai tradition. Crucially, the study found little evidence for the catastrophic, self-inflicted population collapse the old deforestation narrative depends on. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy themselves. They faced a sustained climate crisis and they adapted, changing rituals, restructuring society, holding on. The devastation that eventually did arrive came later, and from outside: European contact, slave raids, and introduced disease in the 1700s and 1800s. A separate 2025 study, a high-resolution 3D scan of the Rano Raraku quarry, led by Carl Lipo and colleagues at Binghamton University, adds one more piece. The quarry wasn't a single centralized operation. It was divided into at least 30 distinct carving zones, each with its own subtle stylistic signature, suggesting independent family or clan groups working in parallel rather than one authority directing everything from the top down. Put those two findings together with the precision decay pattern from Act 7, and a clearer picture forms. The knowledge behind the monument system wasn't held by one priesthood or one bloodline whose disappearance would erase it instantly. It was distributed, spread across dozens of independent groups, each maintaining their own piece of the tradition. When the drought reshaped the island's social structure and the old lineage system gave way to Tangata Manu, that distributed knowledge network didn't collapse all at once. It frayed gradually, group by group, until the technical understanding behind the alignments outlived the people who could still execute them. What followed the drought era was, by any measure, harder to sit with. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to record contact with the island in 1722, naming it for the day he arrived, the Rapa Nui population had already weathered a century of climate stress and social upheaval, but it was still an intact, functioning society. What came after European contact was not adaptation. Successive waves of foreign disease tore through a population with no prior immunity. Decades later, Peruvian slave raids in the 1860s abducted a significant portion of the remaining islanders, including much of the class of elders and specialists most likely to still hold fragments of the old technical knowledge, and shipped them to labor camps thousands of miles away, where the overwhelming majority never returned. By the 1870s, the island's population had collapsed to a small fraction of what it had been at its height. This matters for how we tell this story, because for decades, the popular version put the blame entirely on the Rapa Nui themselves, a civilization so reckless it destroyed its own island, and by implication, brought its own suffering. The 2025 climate data doesn't erase every hardship the islanders faced before contact. It does make clear that the civilization was still standing, still adapting, still functioning, right up until forces from outside the island arrived and did what the drought alone never managed to do: step back from the individual pieces, and what's left doesn't fit the category we've been using for 300 years. This wasn't a settlement that happened to build some monuments on the side. It was a positioned, integrated system: astronomical clocks built into platform angles, navigational bearings built into statue sightlines, distance annotations built into resonant stone hats, a sensory pilgrimage built into the roads connecting them, and quite possibly a written key to the whole system sitting untranslated on wooden tablets for a century and a half. What's still genuinely unresolved is where the underlying knowledge came from in the first place. The Rapa Nui's ancestors were extraordinary navigators. The broader Polynesian expansion across the Pacific remains one of the most remarkable feats of human exploration in history. But nothing documented at any comparable Polynesian site matches this specific, integrated combination of sub-degree astronomical precision, encoded navigation, and acoustic engineering. Did they develop this system alone on one of the most remote islands on the planet? Did they carry knowledge with them that left no trace anywhere else in the Pacific? Or did this island's specific position reveal something to them that nowhere else could? And did they simply recognize it and choose to write it down in the most permanent material they had? The data doesn't answer that question. It just makes it impossible to keep ignoring. What's no longer a mystery is what they did with what they knew. They chose stone over wood, over bark, over memory, passed voice to voice, because stone outlasts droughts, outlasts collapsed leadership systems, outlasts the death of every person who understood it completely. They built for a future they knew they'd never personally see, and the stone held through a century of drought, through the unraveling of the very knowledge network that built it, through slave raids and disease, and 200 years of visitors who measured the statues and walked away with theories about ancestor worship. It held everything, and it waited. The statues were never silent. We just didn't have anything capable of listening to all 900 of them at once. Now we do, and for the first time in 3 centuries, we're starting to hear what they were actually trying to tell us. There's a strange kind of irony sitting underneath all of this. For 300 years, outsiders visited this island, measured its statues, photographed its platforms, and left convinced they'd found a curiosity, a remote, slightly baffling relic of a culture that didn't leave behind a real written record the way Egypt or Mesopotamia did. It took feeding every one of those measurements into a system built to hold all of it at once to realize the record was never missing. It was distributed across 900 statues, dozens of platforms, a network of resonant roads, and a handful of undeciphered tablets. And every piece of it had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone or something capable of reading all of it together. If this changed how you see Easter Island, you're going to want to see what else researchers found when they turned the same kind of analysis loose on the pyramids at Giza, because the pattern doesn't stop here.